During the First World War, Britain's railways came under government control. After that conflict, nationalisation was proposed but proved to be unachievable. So instead, the Railways Act of 1921 was passed, which grouped the railways in 1923 into four large companies: the Great Western, the Southern, the London Midland and Scottish, and the London and North Eastern. In this series, we'll take a look at each of these companies, their engineers, policies, and innovations that they brought, as well as what remains of them in the preservation era. This is the Big Four at 100. The LMS was the largest of the Big Four, with a total route mileage of 7,500. Made up from 8 constituents and 27 subsidiaries across the whole of Great Britain, the company boasted 2,400 stations and 3,000 goods depots. In England, these included the Penrith, Keswick and Cockermouth, the Maryport and Carlisle, and the 2-foot 6-inch gauge Leek and Manifold in Staffordshire. North of the border, the LMS inherited the Callander and Oban, the Wick and Libster, and the Arbroath and Forfar, whilst in Wales was the Mold and Denbigh Junction. This led the company to stretch all the way from the Highlands, through the Midlands and North Wales, to Bournemouth via the Somerset and Dorset. Another of the subsidiaries was the Northern Counties Committee in Northern Ireland. The largest constituent was the London and North Western, formed in 1846. Radiating from Euston, the LNWR served Birmingham, Swansea and Peterborough. By 1923, it had a route mileage of 2,149. Known as the Premier Line, the LNWR boasted the most locomotives of any of the pre-grouping companies, but had fewer freight types than both the GWR and the Midland. Its principal route was the West Coast Main Line from Euston to Glasgow, with spurs to Birmingham, Liverpool and Manchester. The northernmost point was Carlisle, with the remaining section to Glasgow worked by the Caledonian. The LNWR also owned 3 lines in Wales. In North Wales was that from Crewe to Holyhead, engineered by Robert Stevenson. Carrying the Irish mail traffic, it served the holiday resorts of Rhyl, Prestatyn and Colwyn Bay, with branches to Llandudno and Carnarvon. The Central Wales line from Craven Arms to Swansea was a local concern, but backed by the LNWR. It saw heavy freight usage, with 5 workings each day. The final Welsh route was the Head of the Valleys from Abergavenny to Merthyr, acquired in 1866. Deep in GWR territory, it supplied coal from South Wales to the Midlands, with running powers into Cardiff. The LNWR's workshops were at Crewe, opened in 1853 on a 137-acre site. By 1923, the works had produced 5,000 locomotives, reaching 6,000 by 1930 and 7,000 by 1948. The carriage works was housed at Wolverton, opened in 1838 on an 89-acre site. Wagons came from Earlstown, the works opening in 1853 on a 36-acre site. The second largest was the Midland, formed in 1844 and centred on Derby. Starting out with 180 miles, the company quickly expanded, with 2 main lines, and in 1912 took over the London, Tilbury and Southend Railway. The Midland had no London terminus of its own. Instead, it shared with both the LNWR and the Great Northern. This caused a series of delays, so the company built its own line from Bedford, reaching St Pancras in 1868. From St Pancras, it ran through the heart of the Midlands to Leicester, Derby and Nottingham. From Derby, it headed north to Manchester via Buxton and Leeds via Sheffield, with a subsidiary route to Doncaster. Another main line giving access to Scotland was the Settle and Carlisle. Following a dispute with the LNWR over the Little North Western via Lancaster, it was the last main line to be built by hand, with 14 tunnels and 22 viaducts. Completed in 1875, it was considered by the LMS to be a secondary route, as the West Coast Main Line served more cities, whilst the S&C had steeper gradients and more stops. At Derby, a workshop opened in 1840 on a 47-acre site. Divided up by Matthew Kirtley in 1873, a carriage and wagon workshop opened in 1876, followed by an erecting shop in 1892. In the northwest, the Lancashire and Yorkshire was formed in 1847 after the merging of smaller companies. Its vast network ran from Liverpool to Goole with its workshops at Horwich. Freight traffic consisted of cotton, wool and coal to the mills in Manchester, Huddersfield and Wakefield, with passengers taking a secondary priority. Spanning such a wide area, the Lanky had many connections with other railways. It was also an early user of electrification, with the line from Liverpool to Southport being switched on in 1904, and had one of the largest shipping fleets with 23 vessels. Further north, the Caledonian was the largest inheritance from Scotland. Its first line, from Edinburgh to Carlisle, opened in 1848, with the company expanding east and westwards. It had a strong foothold in Glasgow, with two stations, Central and Buchanan Street. To the south it reached Carlisle, to the west was Oban, and to the east as far as Aberdeen. The other major Scottish constituent was the Highland, formed in 1865. It served a very remote area, with Wick and Thurso to the north, Perth to the south, and the Kyle of Lochalsh to the west. The majority of the network was single track, with income from tourists and shooting. Its locomotive fleet was the smallest inherited by the LMS, but it did boast the Jones goods of 1894, the first 460 in the UK, and the forerunner to the ubiquitous Black Fives, which we'll see later. Unlike the other members of the Big Four, the LMS became riddled with office politics from the start. Its headquarters was at Derby, the home of the Midland, with offices in Euston, Manchester and Glasgow, which led to a massive exodus of former LNWR staff. Led by J.E. Anderson, the Midland took over the motive power departments, continuing with its own policy, severely restricting development, when its rival, the LNER, was already out shopping Pacifics. Their philosophy was to run short, frequent trains with small locomotives. Double heading was common, with passenger types being 440s and 060s for freight. By contrast, the LNWR had used large locomotives such as the Prince of Wales, Claughtons and Webb 080s. They did, however, have a high coal consumption, with the Prince of Wales burning £51 per mile compared to £46.5 by the Midland compounds. When Midland locomotives arrived onto the former LNWR, crews instantly took a disliking to working practices. They preferred to use a long cut-off with a fierce blast, unsuitable to the new fleet, but they did prove to be more popular in Scotland. In Scotland, the rivalry was just as fierce. The Highland was unaffected, but in Glasgow, the Caledonian and the Glasgow and South Western both served the city and resented alliances. One railway unaffected by the grouping was the Somerset and Dorset, formed in 1876 to link the Bristol Channel ports with the south coast. Later extending to Bath, it had branches to Burnham-on-Sea and Highbridge and was worked by the Midland and LSWR. The northern section to Bath was steeply graded, and double heading was common as motive power was a Midland responsibility. Infrastructure was handled by the LSWR, and the line even carried a named train, the Pines Express, from Manchester to Bournemouth. Freight was largely coal from the collieries around Radstock. The largest were at Ruthlington and Norton Hill, with trains handled by 3Fs and 4Fs. This lack of power led its chairman, M.H. Ryan, to call for a tailored locomotive. Originally, an 080 was planned, but found to be too heavy, and it wasn't until 1914 that a 280, based around the compound boiler, appeared. The brainchild of James Clayton, the design incorporated wall-shots valve gear, inclined cylinders and 4 sets of brakes, 3 on the locomotive and 1 on the tender. The class came in 2 batches, 5 from Derby and 5 from Robert Stephenson and Hawthorne in 1925. This later batch had larger boilers and later brought in line with the Derby batch, and all received vacuum brakes for working passenger turns. The LMS's first chairman was Sir Guy Granite from the Lancashire and Yorkshire. He was later replaced by industrialist Sir Joseph Stamp, who deployed an American corporate system with a president and 3 vice presidents. A chairman was later added, but the system did receive some scrutiny from those in railway circles. The company's first CME was George Hughes from the Lankey, who inherited 10,400 locomotives. Starting on the LNWR in 1882, he joined the LNY in 1886. Becoming their CME in 1904, Hughes oversaw the joining of the LNY and LNWR in 1922, before retiring in 1925. By the time of Hughes's appointment, moguls had become established on the GWR, Great Northern and SECR. With larger outside cylinders and ease of maintenance, moguls proved to be the ideal modern motive power, but a proposed design by the Caledonian proved to be too bulky for the LMS loading gauge. Hughes' proposal was a mix of LNY and Midland, with the design work given to Horridge. The LNY influence was in the boiler and inclined cylinders, leading to a high running plate, earning the new class the nickname Crabs. The Midland influence came after Hughes's retirement, when Henry Fowler took over. He made changes to the valves and fitted a Midland tender, which was actually narrower than the cab. Brakes were also applied to the pony truck, with 5 members receiving Lentz rotary valve gear. Fowler was born in 1870 and started on the LNY under Aspinall in 1887. Remaining on the Lankey until 1900, he moved to Derby, becoming works manager in 1907 and succeeding Dealey in 1909. Deputy to Hughes, Fowler had undertaken a similar role at Horridge between 1891 and 1895. Taking over in 1925, Fowler brought the Midland philosophy with him, supported by his assistant, James Anderson. When he arrived, the LMS was in a desperate need for a more powerful locomotive for their Anglo-Scottish expresses. Double heading was still a requirement, but a plan for a 4-cylinder Pacific by Hughes never materialised. So, in 1925, the LMS loaned No. 5000 Launceston Castle from the Great Western. Trialled between Euston and Carlisle, the castle showed a better power output and efficiency. Following the trials, the LMS tried to order 50 castles, but was rejected as the design would need a major rework. So an alternative design was drawn up by James Anderson, being based on the castles with 3 cylinders. A further request to the GWR, this time for a set of castle drawings, was again rejected, but the Southern did send a set of Lord Nelson drawings. Given to the North British Locomotive Company in Glasgow, the new locomotive featured a larger parallel boiler with 50 ordered straight from the drawing board. Their arrival saw the introduction of a new service, the Royal Scot to Edinburgh. Leaving Euston at 10 a.m, it rivalled the LNER's Flying Scotsman, with 15 coaches split into 2 portions, with 9 going to Glasgow and 6 to Edinburgh. One, number 6170 Fury, was experimentally fitted with a high-pressured boiler, but suffered a burst fire tube in 1930. 3 years later, number 6152, disguised as number 6100 Royal Scot, undertook a tour of the USA and Canada, travelling 11,000 miles from San Francisco to Denver via Montreal. Freight operations too were led by the Midland, as the company had worked through the industrial heartland of Britain. It had 25 districts, controlled from a central office in Derby, who managed the whole operation, from staff hours to diagrams. The system had been drawn up by J. H. Follows in 1907 and first deployed at Masborough near Sheffield. He became General Superintendent at the grouping, with his system laying down a blueprint for others. As with passenger operations, freight was largely double-headed. Once again, Hughes had produced a large locomotive, a 210O, but this was deemed too heavy and had a limited loading gauge. The LMS did try 30 Garretts, but these proved unsuccessful. By 1932, 2,158 additions had been made to the motive power fleet, but, as we've seen, had a strong Midland influence. These included 128 2P 440s, which were underpowered, and 85 080s, combining a 4F with an LMWR Super D, but was ultimately a failure. Throughout its tenure, there was little cooperation between Crewe and Derby works. The Caledonian had also been resistant to the Midland, leading to many inadequate classes, with little standardisation. So, the LMS decided to look for a new CME from outside the company. The answer was William Stanier from the Great Western, who arrived in 1932. He set about making a smaller, more efficient fleet and was given a free hand. To avoid further conflict, his deputy CME came from Crewe and his chief draftsman from Derby. Born in Swindon in 1876, Stanier joined the GWR in 1891 at the Works Drawing Office. Becoming Works Manager in 1920, Stanier trained under the reins of Dean, Churchwood and Collett. With 40 years' experience, including as assistant to Churchwood and Collett, Stanier brought with him many Great Western ideas, such as tapered boilers and a standardisation programme. Taking stock of his inheritance, Stanier drew up three main types: an express locomotive capable of handling 500 tons to Glasgow, a modern mixed traffic design with the same principle applied to freight. With his arrival, management was also restructured. Its vice president was Ernest Lemon from the Midland, operating chief Charles Byram from the LMWR, and commercial manager Aston Davies from the Lancashire and Yorkshire. Davies was responsible for 35 district managers who operated goods depots, stations and docks. He also saw that the LMS was represented in Ireland, Europe and North America, overseeing what was possible to maximise sales. The operating department was reorganised to provide greater availability of locomotives and stock. Staff were also encouraged to progress, with the LMS setting up the School of Transport at Derby in 1938. To attract customers, the LMS introduced special fares to encourage travel. These included cheap day tickets to events such as the Grand National and Blackpool Illuminations, whilst tourism to the Lake District and Scotland was also promoted. On the main line, timetables were sped up and modern rolling stock introduced. From 1928, sleeper trains carried third-class passengers, with new titled trains such as the Thames Clyde Express and the Irish Mail launched, and thus, by 1937, the total number of journeys made stood at 8.5 billion. The faster timings came about because an agreement from 1896, introduced during the races of the North of the 1880s and 90s, was dropped. It came into place following a serious derailment at Preston in 1895, restricting speeds and timings to 8.25 hours. With the agreement dropped, the Royal Scot was allowed 7 hours and 50 minutes, reducing by 10 minutes when it became non-stop. An even faster service, the Midday Scot, was timed at 7 hours 35 minutes. Despite the new timings, the Royal Scot started to struggle, with engine changes being a regular feature at Carlisle. To cover the distance, Stanier designed the Princess Royals in 1933, inspired by the Great Western Kings, but with a 462 wheel arrangement. The first three prototypes had a traditional Swindon low-degree superheater, which was not suited to hard coal or driving. Unfortunately, the second prototype was already in service, but production was delayed. The third prototype was an experimental turbo-driven locomotive, outshopped in 1935. Known as the Turbomotive, it had a main turbine plus a smaller one for reverse. It followed experiments by Lundstorm in Sweden, the idea being to provide torque with a reduced hammer blow and maintenance. The turbines came from Metropolitan Vickers, producing 2,000 horsepower at 70 miles per hour with 500 tons on a 1 in 300 gradient. The fuel saving, though, was never achieved, and the Turbomotive struggled after the war. Rebuilt as a conventional Princess Royal in August 1952, she was destroyed at Harrow 2 months later. Before construction resumed, the boiler was redesigned, with the superheater doubled in size. Working along the whole of the West Coast Main Line, the Princesses handled 500-ton trains and became a regular sight on the Liverpool services, with some based at Edge Hill. For mixed traffic duties, Stanier came up with one of his best designs, the famous Black Fives. Like their inspiration the Halls, the Black Fives could handle any type of duty given to them, from expresses to loose-coupled freights, with 50 ordered straight from the drawing board. With such a wide route availability, they could be seen from Wick right down to Bournemouth, and from Holyhead across to Peterborough. In 1936, 227 were ordered from Armstrong Whitworth in Newcastle, the largest such order in the UK, and construction didn't cease until 1951. Over time, more experience was gained, leading to the superheater being enlarged and the regulator valve relocated. A number of experiments were even tried, such as Caprotti valve gear, roller bearings and double chimneys, with number 4767 receiving Stephenson link motion. By the mid-30s, freight traffic was gradually being improved. One bottleneck was that from Normanton to Nottingham, so the LMS built a new route through the Erewash Valley from Trent Junction to Chesterfield, bypassing both Derby and Nottingham. On the new line was a large marshalling yard at Towton, serving the Midlands. In 1939, the yard was mechanised, with a hump cabin controlling points and retarders electrically, similar to that employed by the LNER at Whitemoor in 1929. In 1933, Ernest Lemon, now General Superintendent, hired Lewis Ord, an industrial specialist, to write a report on freight handling with the possibility of a complete remodelling programme. One result was the Crewe transship shed with its state-of-the-art mechanised handling. The new system utilised containers and reduced shunting. The system was soon employed at other depots, such as Holyhead, where mail was transitioned from train to ship by a conveyor. At this time, the LMS was the largest freight handler of the Big Four, but the old middle and small engine policy still dominated. As we've seen, both the 7F080s and Garretts failed, so once again, Stanier turned to the Great Western, combining the 2800 with his Black 5. The result was the 8F, which could haul heavier loads at faster speeds, with vacuum brake stock now reaching 50 miles per hour. This was particularly noticeable in Derbyshire, where the 8Fs handled 1,000-ton limestone trains. By 1939, 126 had been completed, and the class was later adopted as a War Department standard. A year after the 8Fs, number 6201 Princess Elizabeth hauled 7 coaches, weighing 225 tons, the whole length of the West Coast Main Line, in 5 hours 53 minutes. The return run with 8 coaches was achieved in 5 hours 44 minutes, with an average speed of 70 miles per hour. With a new Monarch in 1937, the record paved way for a new 6-hour service from Euston to Glasgow, including a 2-minute stop at Carlisle. New stock was designed, sporting either a blue and silver or crimson and gold livery, and a new streamlined locomotive. An improvement on the Princess Royal, the Princess Coronation or Duchess had the largest superheater from new and the largest firebox in the UK at 50 square feet. On a test run, number 6234 Duchess of Abercorn set a horsepower record at 3,300 with 605 tons. The first member, number 6220 Coronation, even held the world speed record at 112 miles per hour for a short while. In 1939, number 6229 Duchess of Hamilton, disguised as Coronation, toured the USA as part of a visit to the New York World Fair. Not all the Duchesses carried streamlining, with those that did being defrocked during the war. The last two were modified by Ivatt with roller bearings and a new trailing truck. By 1939, Stanier had reduced the locomotive fleet down from 10,396 across 404 classes to 7,688 across 162. He was also backed by a strong management team equal to that on the LNER. There were, however, still some issues. Stock was often dirty and stations had seen little improvements. Plans to rebuild Euston never materialised, whilst wagons too saw little development, still being largely of four-wheeled types, when the Great Western, for example, was using high-capacity examples. The Second World War was very mixed for the LMS. In November 1940, the city of Coventry was largely destroyed, with 40 bomb sites on a 3.5-mile stretch alone. Reopened in just 2 days, a full service was operational by the end of the month. Stanier even had a go at tank design with the Covenanter. Designed at Derby and built at Crewe, tank production was also carried out at Horwich with the Matilda, with a combined total of 642 vehicles. Derby also built aircraft wings, 250 17-pounder gun carriages, and renovated 23 12-inch howitzers of First World War vintage. The former Glasgow and South Western Works at Barassi, meanwhile, also lent a hand in aircraft production. Sadly, in 1941, Joseph Stamp was killed in an air raid in 1941. Replaced by Sir William Wood, he was restricted by wartime measures, which the LMS would never recover from. As mentioned earlier, the 8F was adopted as a War Department standard. This saw the class serving in the Middle East, from the Persian Gulf to the Soviet Union. Turkish examples were nicknamed Churchills, and examples came from all members of the Big Four, with the LNER buying 68 members, classifying them 06. Given the constraints the railway was under, a surprise appeared in 1943, with the rebuilding of the Royal Scots. Fitted with tapered boilers and described as conversions, they were 2 tons lighter, which increased their route availability, with the last being completed in 1955. In 1944, Stanier retired and was replaced by Charles Fairbairn. Born in 1887, Fairbairn started under the tutorage of Fowler, before moving to Siemens at Stafford and English Electric. Later, he became assistant engineer on the North Eastern's electrified line from Shildon to Newport. Delving into further projects, including some abroad, Fairbairn rose to the position of chief engineer, joining the LMS in 1934. Assistant to Stanier in 1938, he oversaw the introduction of the first diesel shunter in the UK, becoming CME in 1945, but sadly died from a heart attack shortly after his appointment. His only contribution was a 264 tank. This had its origins at the start of the grouping, when Hughes drew up plans for a large general-purpose 464 tank, but was found to be unsuitable. So, Fowler produced a 264 tank with smaller cylinders but a larger boiler, based on his 3P 262 tank, with the first appearing in 1927. classified 4P, construction lasted until 1934. Later examples were modified by Stanier, with side window cabs, and in service they handled suburban trains, ECS workings, and branch line freight and passenger duties. The first Stanier examples worked on the former London Tilbury and Southend network, which had an intense timetable, worked by Whiteleg 442 tanks since 1909. Stanier followed on from Fowler's concept, adding a tapered boiler, modified cab, and unusually 3 cylinders. The first member appeared in 1934, and a year later a 2-cylindered version was produced, with another novel feature for a tank engine, a bidirectional water scoop. As well as passenger turns, the class worked on parcels and newspaper trains, but less so on freight due to their low adhesion. 2 regular workings were the West Riding portion of the Yorkshire Pullman and banking on Shap from T-Bay. Fairbairn's design was intended to replace the many pre-grouping designs still in use. It had a shorter wheelbase to negotiate tighter curves, with construction lasting from 1945 to 51. The LMS examples all came from Derby, but under BR, 41 were outshot from Brighton. The Brighton examples first worked on the southern region, whilst 7 went to the northeast. Replaced by Riddle's version of the same concept, the majority could be found in Scotland, around Glasgow and Ayrshire, and again as bankers from T-Bay. The LMS's last CME was George Ivatt, son of Henry Ivatt from the Great Northern. He started his railway career at Crewe in 1904, working up through various senior roles, becoming Assistant Locomotive Superintendent for the North Staffordshire Railway in 1919. Moving to Derby in 1928, he was appointed Work Superintendent in 1931. After spending 5 years in Scotland, Stanier gave him the post of his assistant in 1937, which accounted for his shortlisting after Fairbairn's death. Initially, Ivatt continued with Stanier's designs, but with some modifications. After the war, he turned to drawing up locomotives based on simplicity with ease of maintenance, and the UK's first mainline diesels. In 1946, Ivatt laid down plans for a standardisation programme based on 11 classes. Despite the influx of Stanier locomotives, lightweight types for secondary work had been somewhat neglected and still handled by pre-grouping classes. So Ivatt came up with 2 designs, a Mogul and a 262 tank with a power classification of 2. Both followed Ivatt's thinking around simplicity and efficiency, incorporating a rocking grate, self-cleaning smoke box and enclosed cab. Both designs had inset coal bunkers, with the tender examples coming first. Initially, they had poor steaming qualities, so changes were made to the drafting. 20 came from the LMS, with the rest under BR, being allocated to the eastern and northeastern regions. One batch of 25 was outshot from Swindon for use in Wales. The tank version benefited from a full-size mock-up and feedback from crews and fitters. It was inspired somewhat by the Churchwood 4500s, but with all the modern features of the tender variety for which they shared common components. Only 10 came from the LMS, with 50 being fitted with vacuum-controlled push-pull equipment. Working across the majority of the LMS system, they replaced the pre-grouping classes as intended, but not in Scotland. The tanks made something of a name for themselves on branches to Newport Pagnell, St Albans Abbey and Stanmore. Some went to the Somerset and Dorset on the Highbridge and Burnham branches, whilst others went to the southern region. Here they could be seen across the region from Waterloo to the West Country. The last steam locomotive for the LMS was a 4MT Mogul, inspired by the US ATC S160s from World War II. A no-frills design with a high running plate, exposed pipework and high-pitched cab, only 3 were outshopped by the company before nationalisation in 1948. The first examples had double chimneys, with the exhausts angled outwards, resulting in a very long chimney. Unfortunately, the steaming qualities were extremely poor, earning them the nickname Flying Pigs. The rest had single chimneys, with the doubles being rebuilt. Under BR, construction moved to Doncaster and Darlington, but 75 did come from Horwich. 34 were allocated to the former Midland and Great Northern, with some going to the Stainmore route from Darlington to T-Bay. On the London Midland region, a batch was allocated to haul boat trains from St Pancras to Tilbury. Before the creation of the Big Four, the constituents of the LMS had been very forward-thinking. This started with the Lancashire and Yorkshire, who electrified the line from Liverpool to Southport in 1904, with similar projects from the Midland and LNWR. Diesel traction was introduced in 1928, when a 4-coach set was converted to diesel-electric power for use around Blackpool. In 1933, the first diesel shunter, based on a Ginty chassis, was launched, and in 1938, a 3-coach diesel set was working between Oxford and Cambridge. Following the success of diesel traction in the USA, all these innovations culminated in the first mainline diesels in the UK, numbers 10,000 and 10,001. Outshot from Derby in 1947, they had a gangway connection, often double-heading, along the West Coast Main Line from 1949, so Midland practice wasn't entirely eliminated. In preservation, the LMS has the most variety, with all major constituents from England and Scotland represented. The company itself has classes from Hughes, Fowler and Stanier, as well as all 3 from Ivatt. The Midland has 3 passenger classes: the Spinner number 673, preserved in 1928, a Kirkley 156 number 158A in 1948, and Compound number 1000. The latter was withdrawn in 1951 and worked rail tours from 1959 to 62 and again from 1976 to 83. By contrast, there are 15 freight locomotives, with 4 4Fs being the only tender variety. Only one came directly from the Midland, number 43924 on the Keighley and Worth Valley. In 1968, she became the first of 213 departures from Barry, setting a new trend in preservation. The best known is number 44422, which spent some time on the Somerset and Dorset. Restored between 1977 and 1992, she's become an ambassador for the class, featuring in numerous S&D cameos. The locomotive is based on the Churnet Valley, which runs along part of the former North Staffordshire route from Uttoxeter to Mansfield. Stone traffic lasted until 1988, with the railway reopening in 1996, and plans are in place to develop a network of lines centred on Leekbrook. The remaining 11 tank engines include 1F half cab number 41708, which ended its days working at Staveley Ironworks, thanks to a contract between the Midland Railway and the Ironworks, being based at nearby Barrow Hill. Withdrawn in 1965, she went to the Keighley and Worth Valley, remaining there until 1974. Moved to Butterley, she had a period at the Swanage and other railways before returning to Barrow Hill in 2005. The final Midland class are the Ginties. The bulk of the survivors came from Barry, but numbers 47383 and 47445 came from industrial service, whilst number 47564 was used as a stationary boiler in Manchester until 1972. 4 are based at Butterley, set up by Derby Corporation as a dedicated museum to the Midland Railway. Opened in 1981, the museum has 3.5 miles of track, from Hammersmith to Pye Bridge, with an extensive site at Swanwick. Another former Midland route is the Keighley and Worth Valley, a complete 5-mile branch from Keighley to Oxenhope. Opened in 1867 to serve the textile mills in the area, it closed in 1962. The first locomotive, Lancashire and Yorkshire Pug number 51218, arrived in 1965, but the railway didn't reopen until 1968. The first line to be purchased outright from BR, the Worth Valley offers all year round travel with a discount for residents. The sheds and workshops are at Haworth, famous for the Bronte sisters. After featuring in the Railway Children film in 1970, a loop was installed at Damon's, and the railway is now home to a number of societies, including the Vintage Carriage Trust and the Bahamas Locomotive Society, who relocated from Dinting in 1990. Climbing up a 1 in 58 gradient, the Worth Valley utilises large locomotives, something not even considered by BR. The LMS is represented by a Ginty 8F and Ivatt 2MT tank, supported by examples from the Lancashire and Yorkshire and LMWR. A Black 5, number 45212, is also owned by the railway and mainline registered, under the custodianship of Ian Riley. Like the Midland, the LMWR only has 3 passenger locomotives. The Grand Junction Columbine was absorbed by the LMWR in 1846, Cornwall from 1847, and number 790 Hardwick from 1873, who ran on the main line from 1975 to 1982. Only 2 freight classes are represented, the Super D number 49395 and Coal Tank number 1054. The latter headed the last train over the Heads of the Valleys line in 1958, and the first locomotive preserved through a public appeal. Displayed at Penryn Castle from 1963 to 73, number 1054 moved to Dinting under the care of the Bahamas Locomotive Society. Over the years, she's visited a number of railways and has been paired with number 49395. The North Staffordshire Railway has battery electric number 1 from 1917, a new L-Class at number 2 from 1923. Number 2 was sold to Walkden Colliery and later restored into her North Staffordshire livery. Placed into the National Collection, she was donated to the Foxfield in 2016. Also part of the collection is LTSR Class 79 number 80 Thundersley, which has been on display at Bressingham since 1968. From the Somerset and Dorset are 2 7Fs, both from the Robert Stevenson batch. Number 53808 is owned by the Somerset and Dorset Railway Trust, whilst number 53809 is on the North Norfolk, having previously been based at Butterley. Another lone survivor is North London 75 number 58850 on the Bluebell, who ended her days on the Cromford and High Peak in Derbyshire. 3 examples are from the Furness Railway, numbers 3, 20 and 25, with the Lancashire and Yorkshire having 6 survivors. The most travelled is 27 number 1300, with Pug number 19 being acquired from United Glass Bottles in 1967. A former L&Y route is the East Lancs through the Irwell Valley from Haywood to Rawtenstall via Bury. Part of a network of lines linking Manchester, Bolton, Bury and Accrington, it closed to passengers in 1972 and to freight in 1980. The section from Bury to Ramsbottom reopened in 1987, reaching Rawtenstall in 1991 and Haywood in 2003. Now running for 12 miles, the railway strongly focuses on the London Midland region. Employing a big engine policy, the railway has seen numerous visitors over the years, thanks to its mainline connection at Castletown. An engineering facility is based at Haywood, owned by Ian Riley, with LMS motive power including a Crab, Black 5s, Genties and number 1300. Scottish preservation started in 1934 with 2 locomotives. From the Highland was Jones Goods number 103 of 1894. After being kept in storage at St Rollox, she was restored in 1959 for that year's Scottish Industries exhibition. Hauling rail tours until 1965, she's now on display in the Glasgow Riverside Museum. From the Caledonian was a unique single-wheeler number 123, outshot by Nielsen for an exhibition in 1886. Sold to the Caledonian, she took part in the races to the north of 1888 and ended her days as the last single driver in service, by then hauling directors' saloons. Like 103, number 123 was restored in 1959 for the exhibition and rail tour work. During this time, she travelled far from Scotland, to Swindon in 1960 for the unveiling of Evening Star, and to the Bluebell in 1963. She is now also on display in Glasgow. Two other Caledonian locomotives are 812, number 828 on the Strathspey, and 439, number 419 at Bowness. Number 419 was the first purchase by the Scottish Railway Preservation Society and restored at Cowles. Based at Falkirk, the Society moved to Bowness in 1980. The Strathspey was the first main line built by the Highland, from Aviemore to Forres via Granton. It became a secondary route following the completion of the line from Perth and closed in 1968. A preservation group was formed in 1971, reopening to Boat of Garton in 1978. A mainline connection at Aviemore was established in 1998, with the extension to Broomhill completed in 2002, and future plans include another extension to Granton. Turning to the LMS itself, Stanier has the most locomotives, with 38, largely due to many surviving until the end of steam in 1968. Some of his designs include Mogul number 42968, the first 3-cylinder 264 tank number 2500, 2 Royal Scots and 4 Jubilees. One of the Jubilees is number 45596 Bahamas, which received a double chimney in 1961 to improve performance. This had already been trialled on number 45742 Connaught in 1940, but being so late was not applied to the rest of the class. Withdrawn in 1968, number 45596 is owned by the Bahamas Locomotive Society. Stanier's most numerous class is the Black 5, with 18. Many came from BR after 1968, with 3 hauling the last steam working on the 11th of August. 2 of the trio made it into preservation, number 45110 on the Severn Valley and 44871 on the East Lancs. The oldest is number 5025 at the Strathspey, being outshopped by the Vulcan Foundry before the intended first batch from Crewe. The class leader, number 5000, is in the National Collection and had a period of operation on the Severn Valley from 1977 to 1989. The unique 44767, like many, started her preservation career at Carnforth. Restored by the North Eastern Locomotive Preservation Group, she was named George Stephenson in 1975 at the Rail 150 celebrations held at Shildon. Since then, number 44767 has toured the country on the main line and heritage circuit. Another well-travelled member is number 45407, one of the Armstrong-Whitworth batch. She too started at Carnforth and sold to Paddy Smith in 1974. 10 years later, she took part in the inaugural Jacobite series and has been a regular in the West Highlands ever since. Sold to Ian Riley in 1997, she was named the Lancashire Fusilier, in a repeat of when the LMS named 4 examples. Now based on the East Lancs, number 45407 has been one of the most active locomotives in preservation. The 8Fs have 8 examples, with a 9th, number 48518, being used as a spares donor. 2 have been repatriated from Turkey, numbers 45160 in 1989 and 45170 in 2010. Another 3 are preserved in Turkey, whilst one was discovered in Iraq in 2003. The best known is number 48151, outshot from Crewe in 1942. Rescued from Barry, she went to MC in 1975, but restored at Carnforth and is now a regular on the Cumbrian coast and settled in Carlisle. In 2000, she hauled a special ballast working over the S&C from Hellifield to Carlisle via Ribble Head Quarry. For express classes, there are 2 Princess Royals and 3 Duchesses. The oldest is one of the 3 prototypes and record holder Princess Royal number 6201 Princess Elizabeth. Purchased from BR by the Princess Elizabeth Locomotive Society, she was based at Ashchurch before moving to Bulmers in Hereford. Mainline registered since 1976, she hauled the first steam working over the West Coast Main Line since the steam ban in 2003. She did spend some time on the East Lancs and played a role in the Queen's Diamond Jubilee celebrations in 2012, but now requires a major overhaul. The second Princess Royal is number 46203 Princess Margaret Rose, preserved by Sir Billy Butlin and displayed at Pwllheli. Moving to Butley in 1975, she was purchased from Butlins in 1988. A group, the Princess Royal Class Locomotive Trust, was formed in 1994, but number 46203 hasn't worked since the 1990s. 2 of the Duchesses also came from Butlins. Number 46229 Duchess of Hamilton was displayed at Minehead, with number 46233 Duchess of Sutherland going to Ayr. The third member is number 46235 City of Birmingham, which went to the Birmingham Museum of Science and Industry, moving to the Think Tank Museum in 1997. Duchess of Hamilton left Minehead in 1975 and donated to the National Collection. Running from 1980 to 1996, she was acquired outright from Butlins in 1987, and, after a steam railway appeal, was re-streamlined at Tyseley between 2005 and 2009. Duchess of Sutherland, meanwhile, stayed at Bressingham from 1971 to 1996. Restored at Butterley between 1998 and 2001, she hauled the Royal Train on the main line in 2002, the first steam locomotive to do so since 1967, and later repeated the feat over the Settle in Carlisle in 2005. The only locomotives from Fairburn are numbers 42073 and 42085. Both withdrawn from Normanton, they were stored at Carnforth, moving to the Lakeside and Haverthwaite in 1970, and together hauled its inaugural train in 1973. The Ivatt tanks have 4 examples, 2 from BR and 2 from Barry. Number 41241 hauled the Keithy and Worth Valley's inaugural train in 1968, with USA number 30072. The most travelled is number 41312 on the Mid-Hants, whilst the Isle of Wight Steam Railway is home to numbers 41298 and 41313. The tender version has 7 locomotives, with 3 coming from BR. These were numbers 46443, which reopened to the Severn Valley in 1970, number 46464, doing the same on the Strathspey in 1978, and number 46441, currently on the Lakeside and Haverthwaite. The Severn Valley is also home to the only Flying Pig, number 43106, having been based there since 1968. But the jewel in the LMS crown is the Settle and Carlisle. During the 1970s, it saw little investment, with stations closed, traffic diverted away, and infrastructure deteriorating. This all led British Rail to earmark its closure in 1984. A group, the Friends of the Settle and Carlisle, had been set up in 1981 and mounted a vigorous campaign. The line soon grew in popularity, and by 1989, when the closure plans were dropped, the S&C was carrying 450,000 passengers a year. Since then, traffic levels have increased and 8 stations reopened. Rail tours have worked over the S&C since 1978, with locomotives from all of the Big Four and BR. A challenging route for Crewe's, a regular feature is the Cumbrian Mountain Express, thanks firstly to Steamtown and then the West Coast Railway Company at Carnforth, with the latter having its own fleet. We enter this programme with number 46229 Duchess of Hamilton powering up Shap, and be sure to take a look at the other episodes in this series.